I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 72 of EO Radio Show. This is our 9th in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In previous episodes, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. In other episodes, we focused on the state filings in Nevada, Arizona, Washington State, Oregon, Alaska, Hawaii, New York and New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. With the help of Joe Hilliard, today we move south to look at the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Florida and Louisiana. You can find all the prior quick tip episodes on state filings on our website or at the Farella YouTube channel, where there is a playlist just for state filing requirements. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella Braun Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural persons. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the laws, they have to provide notice as to the legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, but instead we are focusing on the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters. As with all the states we've discussed, if you do business as a nonprofit in Louisiana or Florida or solicit charitable contributions there, even if just through the nonprofit corporation's website, the nonprofit may need to have a legal presence and be registered in these two states. For the details on these states, I'm happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities, and in particular charities that are tax-exempt under Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3. Prior to working at Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Hey, Cynthia, it's good to be back again.
So let's start with Florida today. Walk us through the documents needed to form a new nonprofit in Florida, and then talk a little bit about the foreign organization and how they qualify to do business there.
For sure. So the Department of State Division of Corporations is what governs Florida entity formations. They do have a form articles of incorporation for a domestic not-for-profit corporation. Do note that they use the term not-for-profit rather than nonprofit in all of their documentation. I mean, it's just a choice of words, but it's not one we usually see anymore. The nonprofit has largely taken the place of using not-for-profit. Their form is a 2-page blank space fill-in like we've seen in a lot of the states we've talked about. And this is for most of the articles. Some of the specifics, Article 3 allows you to set out the specific purpose. Article 4 is kind of interesting. It asks for the manner in which the directors will be elected or appointed. It's not something we have seen before, and it's kind of unusual.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, usually that's just in the bylaws, but here, apparently it's got to be in the state filing.
Yes. And then Article 5 is for your initial officers and directors, and it does ask for addresses. As we talk about often here, this does not distinguish as being needed as their home address. It can simply be an address of record. Article 7 similarly asks for the name and address of our incorporator. As we've seen in a lot of these blank forms, there's not a specific section to put language for the nonprofit IRS required specific distribution provisions, although the Article 2 fill-in gives you an ample space to use for this in the purpose. On the foreign nonprofit side, the state has, and it's a very long title here, maybe the longest title we've seen of any document. It's an application by a foreign not-for-profit corporation for authorization to conduct its affairs in Florida. Yes, it's a 2-page form, and about half of it is the name of the form. It's same thing. It asks basic items, the state of your incorporation, the name to be used if that name is not available in Florida, its purpose, the director and officer identification, again, addresses here. Interesting, this one also has a checkbox document for all the titles for the directors and officers. So you go down, rather than put vice president as a fill-in next to it, you check this is the vice president, you check this is the president. And it also notes that the chair needs to be identified when you're discussing the board members. So you have to check off your chair there. Both of these filings can be done online. Really, this is the preferred method in Florida. They do through their online portal, and unlike a lot of these where we've seen them use the state's name and SOS, there's a Sunbiz, sunbiz.org.
All right. That's different. What are the expenses for filing both the new entity and the application for a foreign authorization?
For the domestic articles, it costs $35, and then for the foreign authorization, it's $70.
Is there an expedite option?
I did not find one when we talked about Florida. They were you just do the online. They have an online processing link, and when I looked at these last week, as of Valentine's, February 14th, they were processing mailed domestics from January 16th, the e-file to February 9th, and then the foreign from January 22nd, irrespective of how they were filed. So online, you're talking about 5 business days to form there, and closer to 3 weeks, about 20 business days for a foreign. So little long.
Yeah, and especially if there's not an expedite option, but
yes,
but relatively cheap. So I guess you just need to plan ahead a little bit in Florida. So
yes.
Talk a little bit about transparency or privacy issues for these filings.
As we noted when we talked about the articles and the foreign application, you need the names and addresses of your directors, your registered agent, and your officers. Then when it comes to your annual filings, you will again have to relist these names and addresses. As we go down here further and discuss some of the annual report issues, the EIN for the entity will need to be disclosed on the annual reports, which is also not something we normally see as being mandated in terms of what the Secretary of State's looking at. But here we do want to see the EIN show up for your foundation when you do your annual reports.
But that's only the annual, because it would be a loopy thing for the initial formation where you may not have your EIN.
We will talk
yet.
about that in Louisiana. So.
Okay. So the annual filings, when do they do? Is this an interesting schedule?
Theirs are due between January 1st and May 1st of each year, irrespective of when that nonprofit was formed or when you registered it. So they have a regular time frame for you.
Okay. And the fee and any other state agencies in Florida?
So the fees are $61.25, which is a very oddly specific number out, and that's for both domestic and foreign filings. The Sunbiz website that we discussed only allows for online filings of the annual reports. They are going away from allowing you to file a paper one. It looked like you could jump through a few hoops to print one out and do it, but it was definitely not the preferred method in Florida.
Well, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and we've talked about this a couple times ago, that really a lot of states are really going away from any paper at all if they can get away with it. So the modern age. Other agencies, if you're organized there in Florida, or if you're soliciting or holding assets or doing business, you will be required to register with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the FDACS, and file an annual report, which is similar again to what we see like the CT ones or the RRF ones here in California, where you're attaching your 990 and you're talking about how your foundation is run. And additionally, if you're obtaining state tax exemptions in Florida, you can apply with the Florida Department of Revenue. Links for both of these and all the other Florida things we've talked about are in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. So that's interesting. It's not the Attorney General's office in Florida. It's more of a consumer services agency.
Yeah.
But as a note, we have found that Florida is relatively assertive in requiring registration of charities that solicit there. So a word to the wise, if you're not incorporated in Florida, but you are soliciting there, it's one to definitely pay attention to. So moving a little bit to the west, let's talk about Louisiana, and then maybe in our next few episodes, we'll cover the states in between and finish the Gulf Coast there. Louisiana, what do we need to file in the state of Louisiana to create a new nonprofit corporation there?
In Louisiana, their Secretary of State governs the formations. And much like we just talked about with Florida, their domestic articles of agreement is what they call it. Articles of agreement is a 2-page form, which is also one of those fill-ins. Some of the highlights there. The second article sets out the specific purpose as a checkbox to note whether it will fall under Louisiana nonprofit law, and a second checkbox for limiting the corporate activity. Article 3 sets out, quote, provisions for establishing membership and participation, unquote, in the nonprofit, which again is interesting as a nonprofit. We've talked a little bit about having members and not having members in prior episodes, and it's not common for us to recommend having members, but it does give you the option here. Article 7 notes the name and address of the incorporator. Article 8 asks for the initial board and their, quote, municipal, unquote, address, which cannot be a P.O. box, and the term of their office. That's something we haven't seen before, is the asking for the term already in this initial filing. Article 10 sets out, quote, other provisions, unquote. And again, as there's not an IRS-required specific distribution provision, this would be the place to insert it, that language in this form. You would put it not in the purpose, but here they have an actual other provisions, which makes more sense for that. Also, and unlike other states we've reviewed so far, this needs to be notarized.
Oh, wow. That's a pain.
And both the incorporator and the agent need to be notarized. I just registered an LLC in Louisiana just before the end of the year, and this became an issue where we had to have it notarized, and then this state didn't like one of the languages, and we had to have it resent and re-notarized. So really, this is one where you really want to mind your P's and Q's on your document to make sure that you got it, what you wanted to say when you file it.
Yeah, and that's a good point. The notary attestation language varies from state to state. So
yes, here in California, the jurettes are notably different, have different language, and they're very specific about a lot of cross-outs and when you do it. So yes, be very mindful of that. As we say, just like anything else, make sure you have a trusted notary when you are getting your documents done.
All right. So our foreign nonprofit that is soliciting or active in Louisiana, what do they file?
So for the foreign nonprofit, you file an application for authority to transact business in Louisiana. It's a generic form for both nonprofit and business corporations. While unusual, we've seen this at least once before up in one of our New England states. It's a checkbox right there. You check nonprofit or you check for-profit. It's only a one-page document. The items to think about would be Article 4, where you do have to identify the EIN. We discussed this with Florida, but here, if you are a foreign, you should have it already when you're doing your registration in Louisiana and have that ready to go. Article 9 is the nature of the business, which again, since this is because it's generic, this is where you would talk about your nonprofit purpose here. Then Article 10 has names and addresses of all the directors and officers. And again, same as the domestic, it needs to be signed and notarized by an officer and by the agent. Additionally, contemporaneously with the formation and or registration, the entity needs to register for a tax account online with here we go, just like Sunbiz in Louisiana, it's GeauxBiz. With the French, it's GEAUX biz, geauxbiz.org. That's their web portal. And for this registration, you've got, now that you've filled out and got your thing notarized, you have then a fill out here. You need to identify the name, the home address, the phone, and the social security numbers for all your directors and officers.
Wow. Personal social security numbers. Okay.
Yes. The EIN of the nonprofit, your NAICS code, and we've discussed those before, whether you will have any employees, who the payroll contact may be. Then there are also specific questions related to the 501c3 status and where your application is in place. Again, this goes back to all these other ones. It's like if you're going to ask other states, if you're going to have a tax exemption, then you file with their Department of Revenue or whatever. In Louisiana, it's face forward. This is where you start. You have to already have this paperwork in place. And then you just mark, I'm a 501c3, and we won't be. But they want all this paperwork in. Again, we were just talking about an LLC that I was registering at the end of 2023. And this became an issue because they pushed back and said, you need to have all of this stuff filled out, including the social securities. We pushed back on not doing that. And it was like, no, you need to have these to file to start up. They do consider this, it's an internal thing. It's not documents that are publicly available, this tax information that goes into the GeauxBiz website, but they will request it.
So this is, to put a fine point on it, for an organization that's soliciting nationally through their website to raise funds from everywhere. If you're touching Louisiana, this is for many directors and officers, this would be a pretty big deal. More and more people are getting very sensitive about providing their social security numbers. It is what it is, apparently, in Louisiana. Maybe we've covered all the transparency concerns for Louisiana, but it sounds like, well, is there more there?
I kind of ran right into it because it's kind of heavy on your head. But again, like I said, I think I do want to stress that it's not publicly available. Yes, there are security concerns about pushing it through there. We've talked about this too, that state websites on the whole show themselves to be fairly secure. They're not things that are broken into easily or ransomware easily, but be aware that there is the security concern. You are pushing this out over the internet, and it's only going to be into their locked system. It's not going to be publicly available, but you do need to identify it.
So jumping ahead, we'll come back to the cost and the timing for filing. For the annual reports, though, as the directors and officers change, do their socials need to be listed as well? Or is it at that point, is it just the names and addresses?
So in the annual report, no, it's just names and addresses. In theory, that would be something you would have to report back to the tax side of it within the Joe Biz, but there's not an obligation to update that when you file your annual report. No, the annual report is more standalone. This is just part of the actual formation or registration where you have to put this part into the taxes as well.
In the tax side. Okay. All right. Okay. So backing up a little bit, what do we need to go back to? The cost and the timing for filing to get ourselves compliant in Louisiana.
The filing fee for the domestic nonprofit is $75 and the foreign application is $125. We talked about they prefer online on the Joe Biz. They will charge you an additional $5 convenience fee for filing online as well. So it becomes $80 and $130 with that put into it. I guess if you used a ACH, you could get away without that $5 off if you felt more comfortable using that. I think very few places do. I know that we use corporate cards to pay for things and not using a checking ACH. And then the timing, the Louisiana website didn't offer a processing time update per se. Their current online estimate notes 3 to 5 business days for online filings and 2 to 3 weeks for mail filings. Here they do offer a 24-hour expedite for $30 and a priority expedite or waiting for $50. It's more of an over-the-counter, which you can do with your service. We talk about that with your agent service. They can drop it off and wait for it. But either way, those aren't significant drops in terms of an expedite. We talk about California where the expedite for 24 hours is $350. $30 is relatively minor to make sure you're timely here to get your paperwork back.
All right. And I had jumped the gun on the annual report, which is due.
Annual reports here are like what we see here in our home state of California, where it's the anniversary date each year. So if I form today, February 20th is my date forever for my foundation. And the fees, it's $15 for a domestic, $30 for the foreign, and same thing, the $5 online fee for using your credit card.
Any other agencies in Louisiana? So we talked about the tax.
Yeah, we talked about having to register as a tax in terms of I guess that's more of a workers' comp thing. We talked about giving your payroll and your employees thing. That's what they're primarily going through there. But if you are going to be organized there in Louisiana, or if you're going to hold assets, solicit, you need to register with the Louisiana Department of Justice and specifically then their Office of Attorney General within there. This is more commonly what we see in all the other states. And then their Department of Revenue handles the state tax, the sales tax exemptions. They have a really good handbook on all the requirements, and I've listed that in the show notes. So both of these sites, Louisiana, their Department of Revenue and their Department of Justice, have very good online helps for you on that side.
Okay, so thanks again, Joe. This has been a quick little tour of Louisiana and Florida. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this episode. As we mentioned, be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the resources in Florida and Louisiana that Joe mentioned. And there are also links to the earlier episodes on the other states that we've already covered. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we have a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including one that we're building where all the state filing episodes are in one place. So look for that link in the show notes as well. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella Braun Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.